You're not naive. You're complicit. And no, not in someone else's lie, but in your own. You've known since day one, but you chose to call it hope just so you wouldn't have to say the word fear. You think you're protecting yourself, but you're actually just delaying the moment when you'll have to admit you have no one else to blame. But that's not the real point. The real point is that you've become a person who knows and still acts as if they don't. You know that moment when you feel something before you can explain it in words. That little jolt in your stomach, a brief signal that something in this situation isn't what it appears to be. That moment lasts 2 seconds. And then the explanation begins. You tell yourself you're overreacting. You tell yourself the situation is complicated. You tell yourself you don't want to react impulsively. You tell yourself you need to understand the bigger picture. All of this sounds reasonable, and that's precisely why it's dangerous, because those sentences come after you already knew. Before the story comes perception. Before the justification comes the signal. And that signal was precise, but you translated it. You transformed it into something softer, into something you can bear without having to make a move. That's where self-deception begins. Not in dramatic lies, but in small translations of reality. In tiny shifts of meaning. Someone withdraws, you say they need space. Someone avoids conversation, you say they're just stressed. Someone keeps you constantly waiting, you say it's not the right time yet. You take a fact and strip it of its sharpness. And then you do what looks like maturity. You analyze, you interpret, you give another chance. The problem is that this isn't maturity, it's postponement, it's buying time without a decision. Consider this image. You constantly wipe the mirror that you yourself have fogged. For a moment you wipe it and see clearly. For a moment you see how things stand, and then you exhale on the same glass again. Fog again. Explanation again. Another version of reality that doesn't demand a cut. And the cycle continues. Over time, something else happens, and this is the most dangerous part. That first signal in your body begins to seem unreliable. You start to doubt it. You start to trust your own rationalizations more than your own perception. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm interpreting this wrong. And then self-deception stops being just a moment. It becomes a structure. You don't live in a lie because you don't see. You live in a lie because you've learned not to trust what you see. And that's where the price begins. Not the price of the relationship, not the price of the situation, the price of you. Because once you lose trust in your own perception, there will always be a story that sounds more convincing than reality. Convincing enough to keep you there a little longer. And you know what a little longer means. It means, again. Self-deception doesn't begin with lies. Lies are crude. A lie means you know the truth and decide to hide it. Self-deception is more sophisticated. It doesn't hide facts, it translates them. And that translation always does one thing. It strips the sharpness from what you see so you don't have to make a move. Because truth has one awkward property. Truth demands action. If you clearly see that a relationship isn't working, you have to change something. If you clearly see that a job isn't going anywhere, you have to make a decision. If you clearly see that someone is constantly pushing you to second place, you have to set a boundary. Precision forces you to make a cut. A cut is what most people instinctively avoid, not because they don't see, but because they see the consequence. The consequence might be conflict. The consequence might be loss. The consequence might be admitting to yourself that you've invested for a long time in something that won't develop the way you expected. And there the mind makes a small maneuver. It doesn't reject the fact, it just places it in a frame that doesn't demand change right away. Suddenly, the situation is no longer clear. It becomes complicated. Maybe it needs more time. Maybe it needs more understanding. Maybe it needs more patience. And so the decision slides into the future. That's the heart of the mechanism. Rationalization buys time. Not neutral time, but time without conflict and without decision. But time isn't free. Every time you postpone a clear perception, something small happens inside you. That first signal you felt at the beginning starts to lose its authority. You start to trust your own explanations more than your own observation. And there a paradox appears. The more you try to understand the situation, the less certain you become of what you see. You try to analyze once more, explain once more, find one more version of the story that will make everything make sense. But every new layer of explanation adds another filter between you and the fact. And after enough time, you're no longer sure what the original picture was. Then self-deception stops being just an explanation. It becomes the way you see the world. Here's how it looks in the most banal, most real scene. The phone is on the table. A message was sent yesterday. Let's see each other tomorrow. The reply doesn't come, and something happens inside you in that first second of truth. That small silence in your body, and then the translation begins. Maybe they're busy. Maybe something came up. Maybe they fell asleep. All of these are possible stories. But the fact is, one, the reply didn't come. Self-deception isn't in not knowing that fact. Self-deception is in immediately creating space so that fact doesn't mean what it means. Because if it meant what it means, you'd have to move. You'd have to stop waiting. You'd have to stop investing in uncertainty, and that's precisely why self-deception is so convincing. From the inside, it looks like reason, it looks like depth, it looks like patience. In reality, it's often just a sophisticated postponement of your own life. Self-deception isn't just a thinking error. Often it's a survival strategy. Some people learn one unusual skill very early on. They learn to read atmosphere. Not what is said, but what hovers between words. The tone of a voice. A look that lasts 1 second too long. A silence that speaks louder than sentences. Such people develop strong intuition. They quickly sense a shift in mood in a room. They quickly notice when something isn't in balance. At first, this looks like an advantage, and often it truly is. Such people can understand others better than most. They can predict reactions, they can soften conflict before it explodes. But this ability has a hidden cost. Because when you constantly try to understand others, you easily start explaining their behavior even when it goes against you. Empathy slowly transforms into rationalization. Instead of a simple fact, an interpretation appears. Not because the fact is invisible, but because it's emotionally inconvenient. Imagine one scene. People are sitting deep in a cave. Before them is a wall. On that wall, they see shadows that constantly move. Those shadows are all they've ever seen. For them, those shadows are reality. They've never seen the objects that create them. They've never seen the light that comes from behind them, only projections, only outlines. And that's why they're convinced that's the world. More than 2,000 years ago, this image was described by Plato, a Greek philosopher who tried to explain how easily the human mind can mistake interpretation for reality. In his cave metaphor, people don't see real objects, but only their shadows on a wall. But the problem isn't the shadows, the problem is the belief. Because if you've never seen the source of light, a shadow looks like fact. That's the irony that people rarely admit. The more intelligent you are, the more empathetic you are, the better you understand the motives of others, the more sophisticated a self-deception you can construct. You can find context, you can find trauma, you can find reason, you can explain almost any ugly fact in a way that sounds noble and that sounds like depth. But sometimes it's just the elegance of escape. At some point you no longer know if your understanding is a form of wisdom, or just a way to stay where you're comfortable. Because truth isn't hardest when it's painful. Truth is hardest when it's clear. When it's clear, there's no room for interpretation anymore. And then only one thing remains, the thing self-deception hates most: decision. The clearest place where self-deception is seen isn't ideas, it's relationships. Because in relationships, facts always have a body. Someone responds or doesn't respond. Someone comes or doesn't come. Someone chooses you or constantly chooses something else. On paper, this looks simple. In real life, almost no one looks at relationships on paper. People look at potential. They look at the version of a person that doesn't yet exist. They look at promise. And that's where projection begins. You start building a story about who that person really is. Not by what they do, but by what they could become. Every contradiction gets an explanation. Every absence gets a reason. Every sign of distance becomes a phase. And so between two people, a third element appears. A story. A story that slowly becomes more important than reality. This doesn't happen only in love. It happens at work too. Your boss says, "We'll see next month." They've said that 3 times already. You nod your head and tell yourself you just need a little more patience, a little more work, a little more loyalty, but somewhere in the background you know that "we'll see" often means something much simpler. It means no. And their self-deception shows its true function. It doesn't protect you from truth. It protects you from the consequence of truth. Because if you admitted what's happening, you'd have to change direction. You'd have to stop waiting. You'd have to stop investing in uncertainty, and that's a cut. In literature, there's one precise example of such dynamics. At the beginning of the 20th century, American writer Scott Fitzgerald wrote a novel called The Great Gatsby. In that story, the main character, Jay Gatsby, spends years building a perfect version of the woman he loves, transforming his longing into an almost mythic image of a person who never really existed. That story isn't just a love tragedy, it's a study of projection. Because Gatsby doesn't love a person, he loves an idea that becomes so powerful it starts to shape his life. The house, the money, the status, the entire scenography. But reality is more stubborn than narrative. And that's why at some point the construction begins to fall apart, not because someone suddenly changed their behavior, but because the behavior was never in line with the story. And many people recognize that moment. That moment when you realize you didn't misunderstand the person. You realize something much more uncomfortable. You understood them very precisely. You just decided to believe in another version. And that's precisely when denial gains emotional weight. Because when the story falls apart, you don't just lose a relationship. You lose the version of the future you've imagined for years. And sometimes it's precisely that future you defend most. Not because it's real, but because without it, you don't know who you are. There's a reason why this pattern repeats itself among different people, in different relationships, and in completely different life situations. It's not just a personal weakness. It's a pattern of perception. In the symbolic language of astrology, there's an archetype that very precisely describes this dynamic: Neptune. Neptune isn't the energy of conflict. It doesn't break down doors. It doesn't bring explosions. It does something much more subtle. It dissolves boundaries. Boundaries between fact and interpretation. Boundaries between intuition and projection. Boundaries between who a person is and who they could become in your imagination. That's why Neptune often comes with the feeling of deep understanding. You see potential in people, you see their wounds, you see their insecurity, and that's precisely why you easily start explaining their behavior even when it clearly shows something else. Atmosphere begins to seem more convincing than fact. Feeling begins to seem more real than behavior. And so a space is created in which interpretation can replace reality. This phenomenon isn't limited to personal relationships. It appears everywhere where the narrative is convincing enough. In 1938, a radio broadcast caused panic in part of the United States because listeners believed a real Martian invasion was happening. The broadcast was directed by Orson Welles, an American director, actor, and radio producer known for experimental radio and film projects. The broadcast was meant to be fiction, but the form of the news was so convincing that many listeners believed it was real information. That event shows something very important. People don't just react to facts. They react to the way the story is told. When a narrative is convincing enough, perception adjusts to the story. Neptune's pattern works in a similar way. The story becomes stronger than observation. Hope becomes stronger than evidence. And that's why this archetype often seems noble at first glance. It brings compassion. It brings imagination. It brings the ability to see beauty and potential where others see only facts. But if the boundaries disappear completely, something dangerous happens. Reality begins to look like just one of many possible interpretations. And then self-deception no longer looks like an error. It looks like understanding. It looks like depth. It even looks like a moral advantage. And in the background, something simple is happening. The mirror is still fogged. The most dangerous part of this story isn't illusion. The most dangerous part is habit. You get used to the fog. You get used to every fact having to pass through an explanation. You get used to perception not being enough, that there's always need for one more context, one more version of the story, one more maybe. And so a mental space is created in which two things can exist simultaneously: what you see and what you decide to believe. George Orwell, a British writer, described in his novel 1984 the phenomenon of doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory ideas simultaneously and behave as if both are true. This isn't just a political metaphor, it's also private psychology. You can see behavior that says one thing and at the same time believe a story that says something else. You can know and at the same time pretend you don't know. And that's where a person gets lost most quietly. Not in drama, but in repetition. The way out isn't an emotional explosion. The way out is precision. Cold, boring precision, not working on yourself, not manifestation, but the hygiene of perception. The first question is brutally simple. What would the camera record? Not your interpretation, not your hope, just behavior. The second question is even worse. What do you gain by believing your version? What decision are you postponing? What conflict are you avoiding? The third question is the cut. What would you do if you were no longer allowed to explain? When there's no but. When there's no just a little longer. When there's only fact and your reaction to it. And then something unpleasant appears. Not new information, not an aha moment, but an old truth you knew from the beginning. The problem was never a lack of clarity, the problem was the price of clarity. Because when you really see, there's no more negotiation, no more explanation, no more going around again, no more trying to make the story prettier than reality. There's only one thing. Decision. And decisions always take something. Pride, habit, false security, the identity you built around waiting. You knew that. And that's why you ran into interpretations. Not because you didn't see, but because you didn't want to pay. You knew from the beginning. You just hoped you could avoid this price.